Good evening, professionals. In our special theme, fund management, today we are going to discuss the fifth series on the fund management, fifth chapter rather. We have been discussing in the past about the fund management in India, history, and we discussed about AIFs more particularly in India and how the various transaction documents, the legal agreements which form part of any such fund management or the AF constitution looks like. And in the fourth session, we did discuss about the AF with specific reference to IFSCs. In continuation of the same, AF IFSCs. Today, we are going to see more particularly about the investments in IFSC AIFs. Friends, the boon was provided by the circular issued by IFSC on 9th December 2020, where the investment restrictions were lifted and without having any leverage. While we are going to see the diversification requirements and how the investment restrictions were lifted, we are also going to see this particular scenario as compared to the normal AIFs, like your category 1, 2, or 3 AIF, to appreciate how these restrictions which are lifted act as a level playing field for IFSC AIFs. This is a welcome move, no doubt, and thus the fund management industry in India has received an uplifting phase, and it is also a welcoming move to compare it in the global arena with the various global fund management setups in countries like Singapore, New Zealand, Cayman Island, Dubai, Mauritius, and also in another country, which is your Luxembourg. So, Luxembourg, where you have these fund managers who are being set up in India with all the upliftments provided, coupled with your tax benefits, which we have already discussed in our previous sessions. With this brief introduction, let's get into today's presentation. Thanks to Aishwarya and Subhash for this detailed research on the subject. Couple of legends used in today's presentation for our future reference and records. First, we will see this circular, 9th December 2020, where the investment restrictions which are not applicable with specific reference to AIFs in IFSC. Then we will see two kinds of investments, the outbound and inbound investments, and couple of recent circulars where the investment by resident individuals in IFSC AIFs, there are a lot of privileges provided to RIs. We will see how these circulars reflect in RI status. First, investment restrictions not applicable to AIF in IFSC. AIF in IFSC is permitted to co-invest in a portfolio company. What is co-investment? We call co-investment scheme. When it comes to co-investment scheme, it could be of two platforms. One, which is your fund-on-fund collective co-investment scheme, or the other one could be your innovative co-investment scheme. We have already discussed about what is fund-on-fund. That is one of the important feature which is available to AIF in IFSC. It is an investment strategy whereby you are holding the investment of other funds. That is, an AIF is generally permitted to invest directly in the portfolios, directly in the securities, which could be a stock, bonds, debentures, or any kind of marketable securities as permitted. But here it is the pooled fund investment in other funds, which is fund on funds. Thus, this co-investment is nothing but the fund on fund which is available in a portfolio company. What is a portfolio company? A portfolio company is a company, which could be your venture capital company or PE, where the investment happens through a segregated portfolio by issuing separate class of units. So this AF is thus permitted to do co-investment in PCs, portfolio companies, through segregated portfolio with separate class of units. Thus, this could be investment by such segregated portfolio which shall not be on terms more favorable than the common portfolio of AF. So that is the string attached to it. Friends, when you compare it with the normal category 1, 2, 3 AFs, which we call it as mainland AFs, this particular permission provides the simplicity or the flexible strategy which you could adopt in any type of investment. And also, this provides the investors, more importantly, to allocate their capital. For what purpose? For investing in those segments where it attracts lucrative opportunities. Thus, it is a welcome one. It also encourages fund managers to set up funds in India, provided in your PPM, that is your private placement memorandum, appropriate disclosures, adequate disclosures are provided with regard to such investments. This is one category. The second category is investment in an AIF which is registered with SEBI in India alongside other permissible investments. So this is additional investment which is allowed. So you could not only do investment only in such co-investment in a portfolio company, but you could extend the scheme of things to investing in AIF which is registered with SEBI. So all these category 1, 2, 3, where this particular AIF in IFSC could invest alongside other permissible investments. Plus the third category which is hidden over here is the other permissible investments which are already available. The second set of benefit which is available is investment diversification requirements shall not apply to these IFSC AIFs subject to certain conditions. Category 1 and 2, generally, they shall not invest more than 25% of the corpus. Previously, we call it, they have modified this parlance as investable funds. So, the cap of investment due to having this diversification requirement, this was permitted for category 1 and 2 to not exceed 25% of the corpus or investable funds. For category 3, it shall not invest more than 10% of the investable funds in one investing company. So these are the conditions attached to these category AIFs. Category 1 and 2 are not permitted to engage in leverage except for meeting their temporary requirements for not more than 30 days on not more than 4 occasions in a year to the extent of 10% of the investable funds. So the ceiling is 10% of the investable funds. They also have a restriction that they shall not be borrowing. So that particular restriction is also attached to this category. Category 3 AIFs are permitted to engage in leverage subject to the consent being obtained from the investors up to the ceiling limit of 2 times of their NAV. However, the benefit accorded to the AIFs in IFSC is they are permitted to engage in leverage activities subject to the conditions as ascribed to in this particular IFSCA, the authority for IFSCs, IFSCA. Wide the circular issued by IFSCA on 9th December 2020. What are those conditions? You seek the blessing of your investor so that you could engage in such leverage activities. You make sufficient disclosure in your private placement memorandum and also take appropriate risk management framework for this purpose. Friends, this leverage, engaging in leverage activity is one of the biggest merit available to all these IFSC AIFs. Why? Because they provide a leeway to take commercial call. They do not have any restriction imposed. Thus, they lift the curbs which are they're already prevalent for other category 1, 2, or 3 AIFs, and the structuring could happen based on the negotiation amongst the parties, and thus it uplifts the spirit of the fund managers, which could be both your domestic fund managers and also your global fund managers. Thus, it is a panacea to some of the long-term issues in the fund management industry in India. This provides solution to many of the problems which were previously prevalent by lifting all these investment restrictions which were then prevailing for even IFSC AIFs. Friends, if you read the AIF regulations, SEBI notified regulation, there it clearly says that AIF category 2 shall invest predominantly in unlisted securities. Now the question arises as to whether the AIF2 could invest in listed securities. The regulation reads thus: Category 2 AIF shall invest primarily in unlisted companies or in units of AIF as permitted in its private placement memorandum. What is primarily in unlisted investee companies is unfortunately not defined in the regulation. But when you go by the general parlance, it would be assumed to be greater than the majority of the corpus or the investable funds. Thus, the single entity and the single investment limit logic, which though does not apply to your IFSC AIFs, it's not coming out clearly in the IFSC operating guidelines or in the regulations whether this particular component of listed vis-a-vis unlisted securities, whether the IFSC AIFs could breach this particular restriction which is imposed for category 2 AIFs, since the exemption is not specifically spelled out in the guidelines. Therefore, AIF2 in IFSC shall predominantly invest in unlisted securities unless and until there is a specific clarificatory note issued by IFSCA or SEBI in this regard. With this, we are done with the first segment. We'll move on to outbound investment. Any questions? Please feel free to ask, friends. Let's compare this IFSC AIFs with the normal AIFs for us to appreciate the benefits attached to the AIFs in IFSC. AIFs generally could invest in equity and equity linked instruments only of offshore venture undertakings. What do you mean by VCUs in offshore? SEBI circular says VCU in offshore means a foreign company whose shares are not listed on any RSE either in India or abroad. However, AIFs in IFSC can invest in securities issued by these sectors belonging to foreign jurisdiction, and there is no restriction imposed. With regard to the ceiling limit, no cap. However, there is this overall ceiling limit of USD 1,500 million with regard to your mainland AIFs. This was enhanced recently. Previously, it was 750 USD million. It got enhanced to 1,500 during the recent SEBI circular issued on 21st May 2021. Then the next one is allocation of investment limits would be on first come, first serve basis in your mainland stream AIFs, whereas in AIF in IFSC, this is not applicable. In your normal category 1, 2, 3 AIFs, it requires prior approval from SEBI for your outbound investment. No such specific approval is required for outbound investment. So this clearly brings out the fact that the AIF in IFSC has lot of privileges as compared to your normal category 1, 2, 3 AIFs when it comes to outbound investment, over and above the investment restrictions which were lifted and we just saw. Again, there is a recent circular, friends, issued by RBI. This is with reference to your ODI, the direct investment in JVs or WOS abroad. The parent regulation being your TRIPS regulation, your foreign security regulations, where Indian party, we all are aware that the principal definition talks about who is an Indian party. Indian party, as defined in this TRIPS regulation, FEMA regulation, they can set up AIF in overseas jurisdiction, which includes IFSCs, under automatic route. Friends, this is interesting. There is no prior approval required. They can set up AIF, including IFSCs, under automatic route, provided they comply with Regulation 7 of this TRIPS regulation. What does Regulation 7 of this particular direct investment by the JVs and the wholly owned subsidiaries outside India talks about? When this Indian party is going to engage in financial services, they may invest in an entity outside India subject to Part 1 of this TRIPS regulation. And the conditions attached to it are: you may do your outbound investment, you may have this direct investment in place outside India, you could also engage in financial services provided you comply with all these 4 conditions. 1. Indian party has earned net profit during the preceding 3 financial years. Indian party is registered with regulatory authority in India. Being NBFC, they should have already obtained their certificate of registration from RBI. They should have obtained approval from regulatory authorities not only in India but also abroad for venturing into such financial sector activities. Say, for example, if they are going to place their footstep in Singapore, they should have certainly obtained their approval from the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And Indian party should have fulfilled the norms relating to capital adequacy. Your prudential regulations in NBFC talks about your tier 1 capital, what should be the minimum requirement, tier 2 capital, what should be the minimum requirement. You should certainly comply with all those as ascribed to in the regulation. Thus, this RBI circular lays down clearly that any contribution from a sponsor, we have already seen in our previous sessions about who is a manager or sponsor being important parties to this AIF and IFSC, they could set up this AIF in IFSC, which will be construed as ODI, which will be deemed to be a direct investment outside India, is the clarification provided. Thus, you need to comply with all the provisions as attached to in your direct investment outside India, which could be your FLA filing before 15 July or your annual performance report, which has to be done before 31st December. All your return filings, your ODI forms, whatever is applicable, shall squarely apply to this contribution from sponsor IP Indian party to the AIF, which is set up in this overseas jurisdiction, more particularly IFSC, for the subject matter which we are discussing. The third segment for today's discussion is inbound investment. In inbound investment, the available routes for IFSC AIFs or FPI, foreign portfolio investment, FDI, foreign direct investment, FVCI, foreign venture capital investment. Friends, you would be interested to know that this particular FPI was the only route available. Subsequently, the routes were added to the bucket of AIF and IFSC, thus FDI, FVCI are also permitted. SEBI circular as early as 23rd May 2017 permitted only FPI route, but as per 2018 November circular, they were allowed to invest also in FVCI, FDI route. Inbound investment by AIFs in India would be treated as domestic investment, provided the manager and sponsor are owned and controlled by resident Indian citizens. This is emerging out of your FEMA non-debt instrument rules, where particular Schedule 8 explanation to para 4 clearly draws reference to inbound investment when the manager or sponsor is going to be a resident Indian citizen, then it will be certainly construed as domestic investment and not as a foreign investment. This is the clarification attached to this explanation. What are the investments permissible under your FPI route? We know when there is an FPI investment, this particular investment should be with a license under FPI, and the permissible investments under the FPI, SEBI FPI regulation 2019 are shares, debentures, warrants which are issued by a body corporate, which are listed or to be listed. Friends, please underline this particular point, listed or to be listed on RSC. Because in the subsequent slide, we are going to discuss about what would be the impact if the FPI investment is going to be in unlisted securities. Here, the regulation clearly draws reference only to listed and to be listed securities. Units of schemes launched by mutual fund, units of schemes floated by CIS, your collective investment schemes, derivatives on RSC, units of REITs, your real estate or your infrastructure investment trust, or it could be your category 3 AIFs, ideas, and any other security which is permitted by RBI for the FPI, foreign portfolio investment route, to be invested, and instruments which are as specified by SEBI. Inbound investment via FPI route with NRI or resident individual contribution. This is with reference to the operating guideline issued for your FPIs with specific reference to your SEBI regulation 2019, where NRI, OCI, or resident individual or constituents of the applicant, contribution of a single party shall be less than 25% in the corpus of the applicant. Aggregate contribution shall be less than 50% of the total contribution in the corpus of the applicant. Contribution by resident individual is permitted if routed through your liberalized remittance scheme as approved by RBI in global funds, whose Indian exposure should be not exceeding 50%. Round tripping in case of inbound investment by AIFs under FPI route. Friends, we all are aware that IFSC is an offshore jurisdiction for FEMA purpose, and therefore money collected from Indian investors by this AIF in IFSC, which is invested back into Indian entities, could attract the provision of round tripping. In this particular chart, it is clearly mentioned as to how this particular round tripping happens. There is no specific clarification issued to our surprise either by SEBI or RBI in this regard. Thus, it is suggested, it is again our personal view, that it is suggested that the personal prior approval of RBI could be obtained while structuring such kind of transactions. For this purpose, a global fund may be set up overseas for investing back into India, provided the threshold limits are not breached. Why? Because here the AIF in IFSC for this particular purpose is an offshore jurisdiction, and money is collected by this AIF from the Indian investors. But again, it is routed back to square one and it is getting invested into Indian entities, and thus the round tripping could arise is the view, but the clarification is awaited from the regulators to see how this is going to be structured. We were discussing in the previous slides about FPI permissible investment to be in securities which are listed or to be listed. So what happens to unlisted securities? Thus, since the permissible investment does not talk clearly about the unlisted securities, it is not allowed, is what we could infer. However, many professionals have divergent views since there is no explicit provision for this. However, again, it is suggested that a clarification could be obtained from RBI before making such investment in unlisted securities, since there is no explicit reference to this provision of unlisted securities for investment. Final segment for today's discussion: investment by RIs in IFSC AIFs. Recently, the net worth criteria was lifted for resident individuals while they are opening the bank account in this particular IFSC for investing more with reference to the investment made in these securities. RIs are permitted to remit fund under the LRS route for investment in securities. Securities or the foreign securities again draws reference to the definition where it clearly says the circular along with your FEMA Act, the parent regulation clearly defines this as any security in the form of shares, stock, bonds, or debentures, or any other instrument when it comes to foreign security, which is denominated in foreign currency and includes securities which are expressed in foreign currency, but where redemption or any such form of return, which could be your interest when it comes to debentures or bonds, or it could be dividend when it comes to shares, which is payable in the form of INR, like your masala bonds. All these rupee denominated bonds, there the return or the currency in the form of return is payable in INR, except those which are issued by entities or companies which are resident outside IFSC in India. Thus, this net worth criteria for resident individuals was lifted by this 19th Feb 2021 circular. Irrespective of their net worth, these resident individuals could open bank account in these banking units, more particularly in IFSC, if such account is opened for the purpose of investing in these securities, where the security is as defined in the principal regulation, and also it should be under the available route, which is under LRS. This RBI circular dated 16 Feb 2021 provides the conditionalities for making remittances in IFSC AIFs by resident individual under LRS. The previous slide denoted the net worth criteria which is lifted and provided the conditions are met with, and this particular point deals with the condition for remittances by all these resident individuals. These remittances made by RIs should be only for investment in IFSCs in securities other than securities which are issued by companies resident in India. So it should be specifically earmarked for IFSCs in securities as defined already. They could open non-interest bearing foreign currency account in IFSC for making these permissible investments under LRS. They are not allowed to settle any domestic transaction with other residents through these foreign currency accounts, and this shall be exclusively driven for IFSC for investment in the securities under LRS, and also not for the companies which are resident in India. There is also additional condition with regard to the remittances made for investment in IFSC, whereby it says that the funds lying idle in the account for a period of 15 days from the date of receipt into this account shall be repatriated immediately to the domestic INR account of the investor in India. If all these conditions are complied with, then the remittance is very much possible by IFSC AIFs. Friends, with this we are concluding the 5th session of our interesting fund management. Yes, Ram, you're right. It will come under your LRS route of 2,50,000. You're right. Thank you very much, friends. We'll continue our learning of this particular fund management in our subsequent webinars also. Until then, take care, stay safe. Thank you.